Okay, so just jumping into this is the scene file that I've supplied. You should be able to load this up. And what I'm going to be doing is going through in a couple of lessons, blowing the crap out of this thing, but also doing all the dynamics, everything else with it as well. So it should be really, really cool to get into. A couple of things I just want to mention. First of all, I'm using Max 2016. Okay, if you're using an earlier version, no problem. I made sure this Max file is 2014 compatible. So unless you're living in the dark ages, you should be able to open it. And in addition to that, I'm going to be using Fume Effects 4. Now, if you don't have Fume 4 yet, if you're on Fume 3.5 or whatever, a lot of what I'm going to be demonstrating is completely cross-compatible. You'll be able to do it in the earlier versions. There is a couple of things that I'll be taking advantage of, mainly the shaders. I'm going to be using the black body shader just because I figure it's a good chance to kind of demonstrate that and show off how it works. But if you want to use regular shaders, is totally fine. And there's a couple other things, but for the most part, I just want to kind of use this as an excuse to give an overview of some of the cool features in Fume 4, but more importantly, demonstrate how I might go about breaking this stuff up and destroying it, doing all that cool stuff. Now, this is based on one of the smaller lessons inside of the mentorship that I run, the Effects Technical Director mentorship. And so this is more just kind of like a light version of demonstrating this stuff, but in some of the lessons inside the mentorship, that's where we go through and do proper buildings or houses, and we'll go through a lot more steps that I would be doing in feature film production. But I just want to kind of keep this light, fast, and friendly. So all that being said, the last couple of things is if I go customize unit setup, I'm just going to explain this as quickly as I can, but I'm going to usually work in generic units, okay? If you change it to metric or imperial, whatever, it doesn't really matter. This is purely just for display. If we click on System Unit Setup, this is your actual unit setup for your scene. So if I were to change this, it would change the scene. But I'm going to keep it on centimeters. That's how I'm going to work. Most of the world outside of the United States, Liberia, I think St. Lucia, Jamaica, a few other smaller places use it. So, for me, it makes more sense just to kind of keep with metric because it'll make a lot more sense to a lot more people. Now, starting with this, the whole idea, I want to keep this really simple. Okay, so I don't have any cameras in my scene or anything yet, but what I'd like to do is kind of keep fixated on about this area. I just want to have this whole area get hit. And I don't think we'll really get into why this is getting hit. Usually I think it's actually a pretty important thing to do is to have some kind of visual cue as to what's causing this. But let's just say some commando climbed up the ladder, got to the top, put some dynamite, jumped off, and bam, it explodes. It doesn't really matter in this case, but I do think in general, you got to figure out what's causing this. You just don't want to have it spontaneously explode. More visually, it's why I'm mentioning it. So this being the file, I just want to jump right in and start working on the fume effects first. When it comes to a proper feature film pipeline, I typically will do the hero explosion effect first, and then I'll do all the fragmenting, the destruction, all the dynamics next. Now, I mention this because there's always a bit of confusion. Should I do the dynamics and then I create the fume effects after that? But 9 times out of 10, when I see people do that, they'll initially create the dynamics, they get the break apart, then they do the fume, they get a feel for the explosion they're making, and then the dynamics just don't match what the explosion is doing as much. So it's better to do the hero effect first, the hero explosion, and then we do the dynamics and have a break apart, and then we create all these secondary effects if there are some after that, based on all the animation that we bake out and everything else. And so that's kind of how we're going to be doing these lessons as well. So initially, I'm just going to do a couple of things. I'm going to go through this kind of quickly, but I'm just going to drop a camera in. Oops. All right, so I'm just dropping a camera in like so. I'm going to make this a 20mm lens. So it's pretty wide, okay? Max's lenses, by the way, I guess now it's changed, but Max traditionally, the lenses aren't accurate. That's like an old 3D Studio DOS thing that they've kind of kept in, but physical cameras are, but 20 mil at least is going to be wide enough for me to work with. And so at this point, what I want to do is I want to start building my fume effects, but I need to create the particle emissions and everything else to go with it first. Now there's two different ways to make explosions in fume. I mean, well, there's plenty of ways, but some people I've seen use geometry or whatever and like animate all the values to kind of get the explosion they want. I try to avoid stuff like that just because I don't want to get caught having to like adjust a bunch of animation curves and other stuff all the time just to kind of tweak my effects. I'd rather it be procedural, really fast, really fluid, just be able to dial in some changes and get the feedback I want. So I kind of like the idea of particle systems just because they allow me to change things very quickly, and it's just much less work. So by the way, I'm assuming that you guys have got some experience in doing effects and everything. Otherwise, I've got literally at this point hundreds of videos out there for free that you can check out that go through a lot of this stuff. But just hitting 6 is my default key. Going to bring up P-Flow. I'm going to create an empty flow. And before we do this, if we click the layer manager, I'm just going to go and make my P-Flow the active layer. I think this is really important, just so that way we can start to categorize the stuff. What's probably even better is let's create a new layer, and we'll call this let's call this effects explosion, and I'm just going to put my P-Flow event in there, and let's make that active, because that way any items or objects I make will dump into this layer. And that's really important with particle flow, because particle flow, whenever you create layers or anything, every single one of these items is actually an invisible object. So they're there, you just don't see them in here. You see this node and that's it. But if I were to load up my script listener and to look at one of these items, like let's say Speedo 01, it actually exists in the scene. So keep in mind, it's just better to do that now than to do that later on. Okay, so the other thing I want to do, I want to rename my node. Let's just call this PFS explosion. I've always called it PFS, which is particle flow system, and I've noticed a lot of people kind of adopt that over time, which is cool. So, you know, that's typically what I'll name all my stuff, just because that way I can hit select by name, type in PFS, anything named that will appear. So particle flow system. Another thing that I do all the time, I just did it without even noticing. I always click my particle flow system, change the viewport percent to 100% and the upper limit amount here to an infinite amount. I do that because that way whatever particles are in the scene, it's viewing them all, okay? And in addition, you know, there can be weird stuff like, you know, if you've got too many particles, it just can't display them all because the memory limits. So I just by default put these two on, because otherwise I might be wondering why I'm getting different results when I render to what's in the viewport. And I might be troubleshooting like everything should be right, yet like I'm getting weird results, and it's because it hit a memory limit. Okay, so I'm just mentioning that. It's something I just, like I said, do without even realizing. So this is just our standard system. I didn't actually want to use a standard, but that's fine. So, you know, I'm going to get rid of a lot of this stuff because I don't really care for it. I mainly just want the birth. Let's say this explosion starts at frame 10. Okay, so frame 10, I'm going to make this emit for half a second, so 10 frames. Okay, another thing, I'm working in film, so, you know, just down here, time configuration, film. I'm just mentioning that again, just so you're aware and you can make sure your scene file is the same. But all I'm doing is that from frame 10, you can see our little system down here, to frame 20, it's going to create some particles. In terms of the amount, right now, I just want to create one. That's all I really need. However, the emitter itself, and we can change the properties either in here or over here. I think by default it should be a plane, but let's change that anyway to a box. Okay, so just selecting your particle emitter, I want to change this to a box, and that way it'll have the dimensions of a box. What I'd like to do next is basically move this box to fit more up here, because I want the explosion to be all the way up here. Okay, so I mainly want to match the dimensions of this object in here. So let's just do this. I'm just going to freeze these sections here. I just, you just right click. I'm using hotkeys, but yeah, basically I just want to freeze that just so it's a little bit easier to see. All right, I mainly just want to position this and get the same roughly dimensions, say like 300 by 300 perhaps, of this guard tower. So let's say 210. Okay, so I just want something like that where the explosion is going to come from, inside of this tower. Okay, it doesn't really matter too much, but let's keep it relatively tight. In fact, let's make it even smaller. Okay, so just something around the area. Now the cool thing is that the way I'm designing this, it doesn't matter if it's really tight. I just want like a center point, and that's what I'm using this for, is basically to say this is the center of this thing. Now, once I've done that, we have this this particle being generated, and I want this to actually trigger a much more complex kind of system. So to do that, I'm simply going to go spawn, and I want to spawn a couple of particles out of this. In this case, I'm just going to do 2 for now. We might change that later on. And I'm going to add a speed operator, link these up. So what this is going to do is it's going to create the initial particle at the very center, wherever it is here. In fact, I'm going to click the isolate selection down here, a little balloon. You don't need to do this, but I just want to, demonstrate this quickly. So right now that particle is being created there, and I'm going to make it spawn 2 more particles. We can't see them right now because they're both on top of each other, but there's 2 particles being created because we said so there. Okay. Now I'm going to change this to random horizontal, and then we'll be able to see these particles a lot better. So this is just our way of being able to generate a particle and have it generate more particles. And I want these to initially just spread out a little bit. So I'm basically saying create some particles around the center of this. So to do that, I'm basically going to, I don't know why his menus are so sensitive. I'm going to create an age test, and I'm going to tell it to live for 2 frames, and then it's going to go into this new event. In this new event, I'm going to add a new speed operator. So this new speed operator, I'm going to set the speed to 0. All it's doing is it's overriding the velocity channel. It's basically saying, okay, get this particle, let it emit out for 2 frames, and then it's going to stop. We can see the colors are changing that represent that. So 1 particle spawns into 2, and those 2 fly out a little bit and stop. And the reason for that, I just want to demonstrate this. I'm not going to do it, but that would mean that we get this radius here. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my settings in a moment, but this is my way of creating a radius around that center point. So again, just going back to what we had, a value of 2, we have the speed here. Let's make the speed much bigger. I'm going to give this a value of like 1,000 roughly. Let's vary it a little bit. And that way these particles will just kind of randomly shoot out. But it means they're going to be pretty spread apart. Now, they're going for 2 frames, and then they stop. And what I'd like to have at that point is I'd love to actually then spawn more particles, because we've created that perfect circle, remember. And now I'm going to do another spawn. And this one is actually going to be the one that spawns the explosion itself. So just for fun, I'm going to hold down Shift. I'm going to left click, drag. That should have worked. And copy. So make sure it's a copy, not an instance. So copy, link it up, and the reason I'm doing that is just because it's easier. Now, I want to spawn a good amount of particles, like 45 particles, let's say, and then I want them to have some speed. So right now, particles are coming out. I'm going to give this some velocity. I'm going to tell it to be pretty quick. Let's say 1,000. And while I'm at it, let's just vary that as well. But here we go. So now, it looks a bit weird, but we can see these particles shoot out and then they shoot down. Now, the reason they're shooting down is because by default, when we create this particle flow, the arrow is pointing downward. So let's change that just by clicking reverse. It's probably the easiest way. So now these particles shoot out and then they shoot up. So it looks a bit weird, but you can imagine you can do some pretty cool stuff with like a procedural workflow this way. One thing just to make this look a little more interesting, right now these two particles are grouped very closely together. So what I might do is just go speed here and click new, and we can kind of randomize their direction a little bit, just so that way they're going in opposite directions, just for this demonstration. Okay, so we get those particles coming up. That's what we're actually going to use to emit our explosion. So right now it's a bit crazy. I'm going to add a delete operator, set the lifespan to 10, and let's give it like a 1 variation. So these particles don't live too long, but they definitely do live for a while. And that way they're going to constantly be emitting out fluid into fume. So before I go any further, I'm just going to go and create so I'm just going to the create panel. And it doesn't matter where we are here. I just want to go to space warps, drag, and drop a drag in here. It's going to move it up to the center, but yeah, so this drag, it doesn't matter where it is, but this is going to slow down the velocity. It's basically velocity divided by time. So in the modify panel of my drag, it's going to give this an infinite value, but I'm going to give it a pretty strong drag because these particles are moving pretty damn quick. So 20, 20, 20 for XYZ. Now, I'm going through this pretty quickly, but now if we add that drag, these particles shoot out and they slow down very quickly. So again, just as a demonstration, I'm going to go back to that spawn. If we had 200, as you can imagine, they shoot out in like a big cluster, and then they would all shoot upward. Okay, but I'm going to go back to 2. I just want 2 particles, and they would shoot out like that. Now the big thing is that I'm going to get my speed down here. I'm going to set the divergence to 45, so it's a lot more spread apart. And that looks a lot more like the emission particles that I want to use. So that works pretty well. I just have it frame 10, these particles get created, and there we go. Now, exiting isolation, I just wanted to demonstrate that while we could see it. So let's click that balloon again, so it turns off. And so we get these particles being created in here. Now, ideally, I want to have lots of these happen. So this is the cool thing, is the system we're setting up, right now it creates 1 particle. So you can imagine if it created like, let's say 10, you're going to get all of those explosions. But right now, we just want 1. And I'm just freezing all this stuff so it's not as contrasty on my screen. Okay, so at this point, we've got the system set up. We have it in the layers. All right, so there's our layers here. And I'm going to create a new layer. We'll call this Fume Effects. And I'm in the top view right now, and I'm just going to drop a Fume Effects grid in. Okay, and let's just move this up into place. Now I imagine this explosion is going to be pretty big. So I'm just quickly setting up to be 500, 500, I guess like 450, something like that to start with. And that's just my basic grid. Now, one thing I'm going to do is we got to set up the output path because we need to save these caches out. Now, by default, they go to C drive, and the reason for that, if we go preferences, is default output path. So you could change that if you have like a specific cache drive to save to. You know, and we've got other options in here, but I won't really get into this stuff right now. You can now get email notifications, which is cool. So you can actually have it email you and say, hey, leave the bar, head back to work because your sim's done, or whatever it's going to be. And there's some pretty useful stuff in here actually, but I'll save that for another time. Now, a couple of new features here I'm just going to quickly mention. I don't particularly use, but this one here will version up your folder. So right now, if we look at my folder, it's the name of my scene file. And so if I click this, it adds a V1 and then it kind of increments up, so VO5. And I do it again, and we can see VO6, VO7. Meanwhile, this here will increment the actual file, so you could dump them all in the same directory. I'm trying to keep on point here, but I will just quickly say I never store cache files in the same directory. If I'm going to do a new sim with a new cache path, I never use the same directory because it's so easy to run out of disk space. I've worked at places like ILM and like Industrial Light and Magic. They'll have the same issue. They'll be like, hey, we're running out of space, free some space up. So it doesn't matter about like what kind of studio you're at, small or big. You will, run into this issue where IT emails everyone like, hey, clear out your drives because we're running out of space really quick. And you can free up terabytes in seconds just by deleting stuff. But it's very easy to accidentally delete the wrong cache when you're not being careful. And that cache could be used by several artists, several scene files. It's the worst feeling in the world when a 1 week long sim then drops out and everyone's renders start rendering out blank because they're all using that asset. So I always make sure I use individual directories. One thing that I use, like this is all stuff that we do in the mentorship, but one of the scripts, for instance, that we write does this. It automatically just created my output path. And the cool thing is that it built based on where I store all this stuff, FXD, and we got the tower shot. So tower version 2, because it's version 2. And then all the fume caches would be stored in here, whatever they're named. Okay, so fume effects 001. And then inside of here, just in case we ever have any stray files, we know exactly where they came from. Okay, so the version, the name of the container, everything. And even when they get submitted to deadline or whatever we're submitting with, it'll name it all correctly, so you can see in the render farm like what grid is being done. So I'm just explaining that just so that way you know why I'm just hitting a button and I get my directories all built, everything pathed exactly where it needs to be. Typically I don't use this stuff. Now I'll mention deferred caches next. I don't typically use this. I do like the idea of it. Basically what it'll allow you to do is it will allow you to submit your standard sim, and then if you're doing wavelet and post-process sims, it will allow you to launch jobs with them as well. And what it'll do is when those jobs go live, they'll essentially keep looking in the directory for a new frame to be cached, and when it does, it then will continue the next frame of the sim. So in other words, if you have a wavelet sim, it's going to sit around and wait for the next like frame 55 of the standard sim to get done. When it does, it will do one frame of the wavelet. So they'll all kind of like simulate together rather than it being like run one job, run the next job. So it's a cool concept. However, like I said, I don't particularly use it too much. The other one is the protected caches. I don't know why it's called RO, but or read only, I guess. So this is a cool feature, which basically means that if there's frames that already exist, it won't allow you to sim. Okay. However, I've been using that for years. I just go to sim, click use nsim, and you'll notice the button is grayed out. So whatever you want to use, but it again, really useful because I have artists that I'm supervising who all the time will get an asset and just, because, I don't know, they're nervous or anxious or whatever, they start hitting buttons and suddenly they're overriding caches when you don't want them to, and that can cause major issues on the farm. So when you're sharing assets, it's cool to lock your sim and then share it, so that way no one can accidentally overwrite your cache. So having an official button is cool. I'm pretty sure I'll never use it just because I'm used to the old way, and I have that as now like a button. I just click in the interface and it locks it or whatever. But anyway, those are the main things in the general tab. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to set up a basic resolution. For now, let's just keep this around like, I don't know, 2.2. Again, I always refer to this down here. If I ever ask you what your resolution is, I'm referring to down here, because people say 2.2 and that doesn't matter what this is. It's all about the numbers you can see changing down here. So that's the resolution. I rarely will go below 200 just because it won't give an accurate sim. So whatever I'm simming, the animation will change. So at least keep it above that. I know I'm kind of going through this quickly, but okay, so under the sim tab, I'm going to keep everything the same for now. Actually, let's just jump over to the object source. I'm going to create a particle source. So before I do that, let's go back in here one more time. I'm going to create one more layer, and this is going to be Fume Effects Helpers. And let's make that active, because I want my grid, okay, to be in its own layer. So that way any Fume Effects grids, it's easy for me to be able to just like render them out and hide everything else. But now I want this Fume Effects Helpers to be active, because I'm going to create a particle source. And another cool feature, which is well overdue, is this is the event here. Let's actually rename this to FFX Explode Particles, or whatever you want it to be. So when I add in my particle source, the system now, just like with thinking particles, it lists your system, but it also lists the events, and you can select as many as you want. I just want one. I want the bottom event, okay? Because that's the one that I'm triggering all those explosions from. So I want that to come from here. Now, once we've done that, we can see the radius of the particles, and I don't really see it because they're so small. So I'm going to bump this up. Let's make it like 8 or something. Just big enough that I can actually see what's going on. And pretty much that's all I'm going to change for now. I'm going to set the velocity multiplier to 2. And that means that if the particle... Let me draw this, it might be easier. I'm using my mouse, so I can't draw very well right now. But okay, so if the particle is here... In fact, I'm going to use my Wacom. If the particle is here, and so that means the velocity is like this. If the velocity here is set to 2, that means it's going to be 2 times the speed of that. So the velocity is going to be more like that for the fluid. Okay, so whenever it's coming from one of these particles, it's going to be 200% the velocity. So it's going to be double what that particle is. So hopefully that makes sense, but it basically means instead of like the fluid moving at the same speed of this, it's going to move much quicker, which is what you want, because you want an explosion usually to be sourced from a bunch of particles here that are shooting out really quickly, and that's what's causing the the shape out of it, because you want this to be high impact, high velocity. So hopefully that makes sense, but that's exactly what I'm trying to do in this situation. So multiplier of 2, a fairly big radius. We could vary it a little bit, whatever. That's all I'm going to change for now. It's going to be relatively simple. And so let me just recap. I've gone through this pretty quick. I wanted to try and jam a lot of information down your throat as fast as I can. But let me just go over this. Basically, we created a particle system, and all it's doing is it's creating a radius of particles that shoot up. And right now we just have one particle being generated, And then inside of Fume, we've done nothing other than set the directory. We made sure this is above 200 to start with, and I created a particle emitter specific to that bottom event, radius of 8, velocity multiplier of 2. So let's run this really quick just to get an idea. And while that's going, one thing I'm just going to do really quick, because I know it's going to look silly, is under the rendering tab, I want to change the color because it's white. So we can already see the white smoke is starting to kind of creep in. Okay, so I'm just going to change that. I'm going to right click and choose keyless mode for now, which just means it's going to be a single color. Let me just stop that for a second. Keyless mode, and I'm just going to make this more of a dark color. Okay, so let's resume that. But that just means that my smoke is that color. It's dark, kind of gray, you know. And I might make my ambient color, my ambient color a little bit darker. So this dark color here, make that about 15. But I'll worry about this stuff later. I just want to make sure the smoke is darker than the fire, otherwise it just looks silly. So that's our explosion right now. Again, this is extremely low res, so we're not going to see anything pretty, but it should give us an idea of the motion, and that's what I really care about, is that pop. I want to see that, you know, really have kick and really look good. So based on that, let's make this a bit more explosive. Let's also make it a bit more detailed. It's going to make this 1.5. Okay, I usually incrementally change my resolution. I'll start out kind of small, but I'll keep working my way up. I'll just mention this really quick, but never just work low res and then just magically type in, okay, now I'm happy, time to go for 2 billion and it'll be awesome, you know, because that's not how it should work. Because there's so much more information happening in a sim. In fact, I'll just mention this really quick. I want to stay on point, but let's just say that let's just say that this is your grid, and let's just say that your grid is only that detailed. Now, if you do a fluid sim and it goes through the grid, it doesn't really have to travel through much. It has to travel through 1, 2, 3, barely 4 voxels to get up there. Okay, and by the way, a voxel is what we're looking at down here, this little grid, this little box. So suddenly, if you're having to deal with a much more complex grid, one that has like a lot more definition, like millions, because that's exactly what's going on here. These are millions. We can actually see the shell, or the cell, sorry. Show slices, grid. You know, you'll be able to see, sorry, voxel grid. You'll be able to see here how many they have. So this is a good example where if that's the case, you know, that thing that took 4 voxels to jump across, it's suddenly got to deal with a lot more. And so there's a lot more wind, air, volume, everything has got to go across. So it suddenly becomes a lot less aggressive in what it's doing, because it's got to battle so much more inside the grid rather than before when it's low res. So always incrementally upgrade, you know, update your stuff as you work. So I'll start at 200 and I'll eventually make my way up to 500 or 1,000, sometimes 2,000, depending on what I'm doing. So this all being said, the sim itself, it is what it is right now, but I'm giving a little bit more resolution. But let's go into the sim. And this is where I want to spend the most time, because this is where I can get a lot more from this. First of all, I'm going to set my time scale to 2. And that means it's going to double the speed of this. The way time scale works is it's more how it's processing everything. It's going to process everything a lot quicker. It means it's more sensitive. It is not the same as, like, you know, changing the playback speed, for instance. But it means that everything will react much quicker. So when we're doing an explosion, that's exactly what we want. Typically, I would set this to at least 2, because usually I think if it's above like 1.5, 1.7, you'll need to sample twice per frame. For now, I'm going to leave that alone, but I'm just giving you a heads up. Timescale is the big one here. We want to make that faster. Now, in addition to that, let's just throw in some turbulence. I'm just going to throw in a value of 1, make the scale 2, I always make my detail 5 unless it's, I'm trying to simplify things. And let's just leave everything else alone. I might set that to 25, but all I've done is I added some turbulence in here, and the scale is how small the turbulence scale is going to be. This is the phasing value, so it takes 25 frames to cycle from 0 to 1. So in other words, the turbulence is going to phase a lot slower. I might as well, I'm sure some of this stuff will be beneficial. So I'm just going to mention for a moment, okay, let's say this is our pretty explosion, and with the turbulence, if the scale is really big, you're going to get like really intricate curls, whereas if it's really small, you're going to get like really intricate, turbulence like that. That's going to be beneficial because it'll make everything feel larger. By having the smaller frequencies, it'll feel larger. Now, the big thing is that if this was if the frame value here was lower, it's going to phase faster like that. So in other words, the turbulence is going to be changing shape rapidly. Whereas if it's 25, it's barely going to change. Okay, so the animation is slowly going to phase things. That's important for me because, again, my pretty explosion, it's terrible, but with this, it means that the fluid will continue. Obviously, I'm not going this extreme, but it'll continue to follow the same kind of paths. So it means it's more breaking apart than it is about being turbulent, because I don't care as much about that. I intend to do this at fairly high res sim, so I will get a lot of that for free. And we also have vorticity, other things like that. So I'm mentioning that, I'm just kind of throwing out a lot of rapid fire stuff, but I'm hoping a lot of this sticks. If not, maybe later on when you watch this again, that'll be a chance for it to kind of really connect with you. So all I've done is I added some turbulence. The other thing is I want to add some expansion. And what that will do is it'll basically just make the whole thing spread apart. So it'll become more explosive. That's all I'm going to do for now. I added some turbulence and I added the expansion. So that way this will become more expansive. The fuel, as it burns, will combust, it'll explode. And usually this is how you change things from being a candle flame to being an explosion, is essentially how much the heat and the fuel causes everything to expand and explode really rapidly. So as we can see, it's already looking a little bit bigger. There's definitely more work to do, but I just wanted to kind of point that out. Just as a heads up, I'm basically making this with the intent of really pretty advanced in terms of what we're covering, but I still want everyone who's maybe not too familiar with Fume, or maybe you're more familiar with Maya fluids or pyro effects or turbulent FD, something like that. I want you guys to be able to kind of pick this up really quick. So I am going to throw out some offhand information here and there, which I think is pretty valuable. So at the same time, everything that we're doing is definitely going to be more on the advanced end, but I do want to kind of ramp into this, allowing everyone who's a little bit more kind of green to have a chance to kind of catch up. Okay, so this is looking pretty cool. As a basic shape, it's definitely more expansive. I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit now, and let's just make this more expansive. Let's make the expansion 3. I'm going to set, the reason for this is because I'm going to set my burn rate to 3 as well. So my burn rate now, it's going to burn fuel slower, which means we need to make this more explosive, which is why I set expansion to 3. This way, it will kind of compensate a little bit and it'll make it more explosive. The main thing is the burn rate. By having it as a lower value, it means that the fire will burn slower, which means that the fire exists for longer. So rather than a quick poof, like a puff, what I want to have is this burning fire that kind of exists for quite a long time. I'm not going to worry about varying it or doing anything like that. One thing I'd love to do is just add some smoke density here as well. So clicking fire create smoke just means is when the fuel burns up, it actually creates smoke. So that way, it'll diffuse and create more of that. So I'll leave everything else alone for a moment. But what I'm going to do, because right now we have that one explosion, right? I'm going to change this to 6, and that will be a chance to basically create a lot more explosions. So if we look at it now, we've got like this constant burst kind of randomly appearing of explosions. Let me just turn this voxel grid off. Okay, so yeah, we got all those explosions like bam, 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 bam. We got lots happening rather than it being just like one puff. Okay, so now I'm going to do another sim. I'll let this one go for a bit. The resolution is definitely higher. It's not going to, it's definitely not production worthy, but we should at least be able to get an idea of how it's looking so far. And then we'll start to add things like oxygen, change the vorticity up. We can look at the new vorticity model. There's more we can get into, the black body shaders, all that stuff. So let this run for a moment and we'll check it out. In fact, one thing, I just started running the sim, and just one thing I'm going to get ahead of myself here for a little bit. I'm going to go to the General tab. Let's click Set. I'm just going to add some channels in here. I'm going to add oxygen. I'm going to add temperature. I was going to cheat and do this later, but okay, so basically one thing I want to get into later is the oxygen. So let's just change this now in the fuel panel. I'm just adding oxygen only so that way we're simulating with it. And I'm just getting ahead of myself a little bit, but I know that I want to talk about the stuff, so we might as well add it. So again, in the Sim tab, I just changed under Fuel, Model with Oxygen, okay? And let's run the sim. Okay, so let's run the sim for a little bit, and so far the motion looks pretty cool. Again, we're seeing it through the ugly shader, because we're about to jump into black body shader, so I didn't really want to worry about setting up gradients or anything. One thing, again, just for anyone who's not aware, if you ever notice your grids clipping, like we can see the blue grid, that's our dynamic grid. If it's ever clipping, if it's ever basically not, the roof, as we can see here, it's cut perfectly along the top. One thing we can do is we can go to the General tab and we can enable, if we look at the XYZ, we can see the Z up is the Z up direction. So I can change this to be Z positive, and it means that this grid will continue to grow. It's boundless. So if it needs to grow bigger, it will. So again, use my mouse, but basically we can see XYZ. So if this was, let's say Y, X, Z, as we can see here, Z, this means that this is pointing upward, which means that this is Z positive and this is, whoops, Z negative, okay? So here I have Z positive, I just put that in. So that means that if this grid, if the fluid here, here's my pretty explosion, if it was to grow bigger, it would actually grow the container. The container will actually grow bigger to compensate for that. Okay, so that can be useful a lot of times when you just don't want to have to resim things. Like you do it and it's like, oh, it's perfect, except look, it clipped the top of my sim. So I'm just mentioning that as well because it'd be really useful when you need your grid to grow. Now, while this is going, I'm just going to also mention, for those who aren't familiar with Fume, this is your blue grid, this is your dynamic grid. So in other words, you've got a grid here you typically build to be roughly the size of what you want it to be. But because you've got the adaptive checked here, it's not going to use the entire grid if it doesn't need to. So it kind of figures out roughly what it needs, and it actually simulates just that. So if we were to pause this for a second, even though my grid is 500, 500, 450, we can see here the dimensions that are being simmed is 268, 312, 217. So in other words, it's being really efficient with that, okay? And it actually tells you what it was before as well, so you can kind of figure out like how fast it's growing, whatever else you need it to do. Again, I apologize for everyone else who's like, duh, I know this stuff, but I figure it's well worthwhile knowing because it definitely seems to escape some people. But that just shows that this is what's simming, this is the physical grid, and then when its fluid grows outside of that, we'll be able to see the additional boundless grid grow out of it as well. Okay, so this is 30 frames, which is more than enough just to kind of get an idea of what's going on. Now, if we scrub through this, we can see the explosion. It's pretty cool. I haven't set up boundless on the sides, so they don't grow. But as we can see, the adaptive grid's grown outside of our grid, which again is really cool. We can also show this in the viewport, so we can see exactly what's happening. We can see the clipping and everything else, but this is pretty cool. So at this point, let's bring up Fume. And I want to go to the rendering tab. And down here, under fire, we have the color source is gradient fire. You'll notice now there's also gradient temperature, which is kind of neat. And let me just turn off the viewport. By the way, the viewport's much faster now. You could not do that before. I don't know what Max was doing wrong, but like Maya Fume could draw dots on the screen really quickly. Max was dog slow. So it's much better now. But the cool one is we have black body. Black body is based on the temperature. So here we have the minimum temperature in Kelvin, maximum temperature in Kelvin. And what this means is that we're able to use the temperature to control the shader. One thing I loved about Plume, if you're familiar with ILM, like Industrial Light and Magic's software Plume, is that what I loved is it had the original kind of density-based gradient, so you would have your color based on the density, but it would also have another gradient for the temperature, and these two would work together. And my typical pipeline in Max was always having to create the render, the standard density-based render, and then I would create a custom pass for the temperature, render both out, and multiply one over the other to get the same result. So I kind of like that you've got these two here. I still wish they were bridged together as one. The black body is kind of different. I'm kind of on the fence about it. I like it and I don't like it at the same time. It's definitely really cool. It retains the fire, it makes it a lot more intense. It has its own look, and unfortunately you don't really, outside of the range for this stuff, you don't really have that much control over the shader. And because of that, I feel there is some limitations, just because I can guarantee you're going to be able to pick the black body shader out a mile away. You'll be sitting with popcorn, watching the next Star Wars, you're like, black body shader right there, and I guarantee it's going to be the situation. So I like it, I just feel like I don't have as much control as I would like. So let me just go through a few of the settings. I'm going to turn on use GPU, and let's just enable shadows, view shadows as well. So this isn't based on any lights, it's just adding self shadows. But all right, so a couple things with this. First of all, we have the temp scale. This is pretty much a multiplier. So in other words, that might be the base scale. It starts at 10, which is intense, but you can essentially tone everything down in one go, rather than play with these settings if you spend a lot of time on them. But this is the minimum that it's going to introduce fire into the shader. So we could set this to be much higher, and we'll get that. We'll get there being fire being introduced more later on. So you can kind of change the sensitivity over time by doing that. So for now, let's just set this to about 1200, and we can also play with the upper value as well, so you can kind of really play with that. For now, I'm going to keep those the same. Blend, again, is just going to be whether it's really harsh or whether you could set it really high, and it essentially will blend the smoke and fire together a bit more subtly. It can be really cool just to kind of get the fire feeling like it's more behind the smoke and everything. So let's just start with these values. I might get my Kelvin. I don't think we're really going to get up there, but let's set to 6,000, and that way it's just going to make the upper range have to go a lot further. So I'm going to keep everything else pretty much the same. There is certain things we can do, like we can enable a ramp, and we could ramp this up a little bit if we want to. And again, it's just going to increase it getting into the fire range. Now, main things I'm going to do, I'm going to set my opacity to 0.5, but my intensity I'm going to set much lower. And I'm going to bring my temp scale down. Okay, so the intensity is essentially going to cause it to be a lot more bright, okay? Whereas the opacity is more density. So it's more the how thick it's going to be. It's not going to make it brighter necessarily. But the temp scale, like I said, multiplies everything. So I want to keep it relatively low because I don't want it to blow out. I don't want it to be too insane. I just want something that's going to got a good range and make sure the fire blend is about 100. So these are like pretty good values. I mean, whatever's looking like here, unfortunately, you don't get the best representation in here of what you'll see. So we'll definitely need to render things to kind of see this a bit better. But one of the key things that I want to do is I want to get my smoke at this point. Let's get the color here. So by the way, I know I'm going through this kind of quick, but I just want to right click and choose key mode, left click, double click on this, and let's just bring this down to a pretty low value, like 30. Okay. And so we're just gonna, it doesn't matter what you have. Don't worry about like, well, what did Allan click here? Just get something that looks kind of good in that area. Okay, so it just has some variation, some range. Now, I'm not worried about the opacity ramp or anything else. I am going to make the opacity thicker, 2.5. So the smoke itself is quite thick. I want that because I want this to feel pretty intimidating, pretty heavy. Now, I'm just jumping to my render menu. I'm just going to render a frame. So I'm just making sure I'm not going to write it out anywhere. And before we do that, let's create a light because we haven't done that yet. So in the create panel, lights, I'm just going to drop something in here. Now, another thing that's pretty useful to be aware of. Let's see where my camera is really quick. Okay, so this is something I see all the time, so it's well worthwhile mentioning. With your camera, a lot of times I see people put their lights right behind the camera. So let me just grab this guy. I see people put the light like right there, okay? And then they worry or wonder why their effects aren't looking as spectacular as they could. I've seen some like extremely high res, like 1000 by 1000 by 1000 sims, and they look really flat and ugly. And keep in mind that's because you've got your light right in front of it, so it's actually washing out all the detail. Okay, one thing that's pretty typical with lighting is you've got your key, your fill, and your ambient. And what essentially is doing is if you're creating character lighting, you want to have some kind of rim lighting that's splashing on the sides or whatever. That's going to be the most intense because it'll make it more interesting. Because then you're going to see a lot more shadow. It'll make it just look a lot more interesting overall. So always try and angle it away from the camera. You can have additional lights in here to kind of fill everything out a little bit, but that doesn't mean that you have this like washing everything out. You make sure it's a character light. It's going to be more over on the side to kind of emphasize the volume more. You'll see a lot more shape. Okay, so I'm just creating that light, but the couple things I need to do is make sure you enable shadows. And also make sure, I'm using V-Ray, so I'm going to use V-Ray Shadow Map. But otherwise use like AB Shadow Map or whatever else you want to use. But just have something in there, okay? Really important. And also under Shadow Parameters, to get this light to talk to Fume, you need to enable Atmosphere Shadows. Otherwise, it won't kind of send that information out for Fume to catch. Okay, so finally, under the Illumination tab, let's just add this light in because it needs to be listed in here. Okay, so those were a few steps, but basically, and I'm just rendering a frame now, but basically what we had was I created a light. I made sure it wasn't behind the camera. I didn't want to wash everything out. That's why you look at a lot of mirrors. They're actually called vanity mirrors, where you'll have like a big ring light or something around them, and they are essentially washing out all the pores and everything on your face, is making making everything really clear. But because of that, you're not going to see a lot of the detail, and that's, I guess, the reverse. When people want to look at at themselves in the mirror or on screen, you want to wash away usually a lot of the imperfections. Whereas here we actually want to see a lot of them. Okay, so this right now is a little too bright. But it's a good starting point. Okay, so a couple of things I want to do, going back in here, and I think I actually accidentally messed up here. So before, just when I was talking about cameras, I clicked the physical camera, and so because of that, it went and jacked everything up here. So I just want to turn this off, okay, exposure control, because we don't need that. So I apologize for that. Basically, I just went to the rendering tab and made sure exposure control's off. Just so that way I'm not blowing everything out, because it shouldn't be as bright as it currently is. Okay, so that looks a heck of a lot better. So yeah, I paused this for a second. I just wanted to figure out what the heck went wrong. But so with the fire, there's the smoke by itself. Now with the fire, by the way, we can see there's clipping. Like, we saw that in the sim. You can see it all there. We can basically see inside of it. So that's extremely bright, way more than it should be. And that's because we're seeing inside the volume. So ignore the sides. I know it's a bit confusing, but that's because we're able to kind of put the camera inside of it, take a peek at it, basically. But I'm more interested on the outer areas. Okay, so it's looking cool. It's a little extreme for my liking, but we can kind of tone it back as we go. One thing I want to do, I want to go to the illumination tab. I can set the sampling here. I'm actually going to bring it up because that way it won't put as much detail or calculation into this sampling wise. So this is going to render a lot faster here. Also multi-scattering, I'm going to turn that on, and that will create lights to represent where all the fire is to help illuminate the smoke. So that can look really cool, but it can also slow things down. So one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the smoke value off. I'm going to bring my fire strength down to 0.2. So it's quite subtle. The main thing is the maximum depth. I want to set that to 7. And that actually means it'll create less lights. It'll calculate it less. So all that's really doing is turning on multi-scattering. It creates all these kind of pseudo lights that represent the fire. And we're trying to say, don't overthink it. Just kind of, throw some stuff in there. Doesn't need to be ultra detailed. And this way, what's going to happen is all the fire in the volume is going to have some slight illumination. And as we can see, we're now getting that in here. It's a little too strong, but we can tone that back. But it's definitely looking a heck of a lot better. But you can see what I mean by being able to make the call on the black body stuff. Like, you can definitely spot it a mile away. It has a very specific look to it. I kind of wish we could have a blend of all of them in one. So I'm going to set the fall off to about 6.5. Just bring it up a little bit, just throwing a random number in, but I want to kind of tone that back a little bit. Okay, so other than that, I like it overall. I can definitely play with the shader more later. I'm not too concerned. So let's keep moving forward with the sim because I want to try and wrap this up. A couple of things I'm going to do. With the turbulence, I'm going to crank this up. I'm going to set this to 2.5 and let's say 2.2. That's just basically going to make it more turbulent, break it up more. It should look pretty cool. Now with all of this, I'm going to make it phase a little bit slower, so it's even slower than it was before. More importantly, because there's a few things I want to do in here. Right now, I'm not really messing with this stuff too much. One thing I'd like to do though is I'm going to change the vorticity to 2. And all that really allows is it's going to give me a scale value for the vorticity. So traditionally, if we wanted to, like, the vorticity basically creates little eddies, little tiny, pockets of air, basically anything that's going to interrupt the fluid sim, give it a few imperfections. And that can be kind of cool, but unfortunately back in the day, there was no scale for it, right? So it meant that if you were working really big, you wouldn't really notice it, whereas if you were really small, it'd be very noticeable. The hack for it was always that you would do $system scale, and it would allow you to kind of change this, but it would change everything at once. So Now that we have vorticity 2, it means that we have a bit more control over this. I don't go overboard with it. If you make it too big, you can kind of imagine, like, if it's a really big eddy, you also got to imagine it's going to be really thick. So if you had like an eddy that big and another one here, and another one there, you can imagine it's going to affect the fluid sim pretty drastically. And that's exactly what happens. You get like really kind of held back, like restrained simulations. It doesn't look good. So what we want to do is we just want to introduce a little bit of the vorticity in. So I'm just going to set the scale a little bit bigger, like 0.05. But I'm going to set the vorticity strength to 1. Other things I'm going to do, I'm going to animate my time scale down over time. So what I might do is get this down to like 1. Let's say frame 35 around there. I'm going to get the first frame, I'm going to move that up to 10. So it just means that it starts out fast and it slows down over time. So it's just going to subtly roll out. All right, and that's pretty much it. Like, there's not much more to this. We've gone through this really, really quick, but a couple of things I haven't mentioned yet was you've got these two solvers now. You've got the CG solver, which is what Fume's always been based on, and then you got the QCG. The QCG is the quick CG solver. So all it is it's an optimized version. It's much faster, and it definitely is. Whereas the other one is purely there just for cross compatibility. So in other words, you load up an old file from Fume 3, it's not going to freak out and say where's the CG? I've only got QCG. So typically, unless you like painful sims, I would keep this on QCG. There's no real difference. There's so much to cover in here, but basically, everything else we've done, we've animated some stuff down. I haven't gone too crazy. One thing I would love to do is actually make this more turbulent upon creation though. So under the turbulence, I'm going to left click. Actually, I won't do that yet. Let's go create an effector. So let's go object source. I'm going to create, let me go to my layers first, just to keep this all neat. So under layers, let's make the Fume Effects helpers. Yeah, make that active. Let's see, create an effector. I'm not going to do much here, okay? I'm basically just going to go in. I'm going to let it read the temperature between 300 and 330. So it's just initially on creation. I'm going to go down, put these to 5. Okay. And then I'm going to go back to sim. I'm going to left click. Oh yeah, we haven't given it a name. Sorry. I'm getting ahead of myself here. Turb effector. Okay, so all I'm doing, this effector allows me to read something and override values based on, in other words, XYZ here, based on whatever input. So if the voxels are more than 300, less than 330, then it'll change the value. So I'm left clicking on turbulence, choosing this effector, and what that's done is using this tag, it's basically going to connect to that effector, and it's allowing me to say, okay, the turbulence is 2.2. However, if the temperature of the fluid gets between 300 and 330, then it'll change to 5. And we can multiply it. We can do a lot of different things. So actually, I want to replace this with 5. Okay. And that's going to be useful because then it's going to be really turbulent when it first gets created. And then after that, when it intensifies or cools down, it won't really matter. Okay, so that's just something simple I want to throw in there, just kind of help break it up more. And there's definitely more we can do, but let's just leave it there. I'm going to run the sim. And also, I didn't really talk about oxygen. There's not really too much to it. It's basically, fire needs to breathe, it needs oxygen to breathe. This essentially makes it more explosive, and there's definitely more things we can do with it. Just again, there's only so much we can do in a set amount of time without this being a 3-month course or something. So basically, I'm going to make this relatively big. Just to be on the safe side, let's go back to general. I'm going to make the X and Y both. Okay, so that means that positive and negative in each direction. this will grow, and it'll also grow up. It will not grow down. So this means that the grid will grow as big as it needs to. And let's set the resolution kind of big, okay? And I'll set it to like to that for now. And if it needs to grow bigger, it will. The one thing I will do is I'm going to set my sensitivity to 0.1, and that means that it's going to have a little bit of restraint when it comes to growing. So again, if the value is 0.01, it's going to freely grow as big as it wants. So the grid could be like yay big. Whereas like having some sensitivity, it's going to try and fight it and, you know, try and stay small. It's not going to be too small, but it'll just help trying to keep it from going insane. So I just want to keep that a little bit more careful not to get too big. But those are the main things. There's definitely more I want to tweak, but I just want to see how this looks initially. And, you know, then hopefully the sim's all good. There's a little bit more to do still, but this will be the main part for the fume. I do want to kind of create a secondary explosion, but I'll jump through that relatively quick. So I'm going to run a sim and we can check it out. Okay, so I've ran the simulation and everything's looking pretty cool. Here I did a quick render just for the sake of checking it out, and I used some basic GI. I put it on low, so you can see there's a lot of flickering. Just ignore that. But everything's looking pretty fine. I do feel like the smoke is a little too thick for my liking, but I'll leave it for now and we'll just see how things go. In terms of everything else, I'm really happy with this. We still have more to do. That explosion is kind of the big mushroom explosion, but I actually still want one that's the primary impact. I want something that really, you know, hits and causes a lot of the destruction. So we've got this initial explosion, and I want to build another one now. So I'm just going to create a birth event, and I actually want this to happen a few frames earlier. So let's say frame 7. And I only want it to go for 1 frame. So say frame 7 to frame 8. And we'll emit 30 particles. Okay, and let's link that up. And of course, we need to assign a position. And then we also need to assign a speed as well. And a couple other things I want to do. One's going to be I want to spawn more particles, and also just the lifespan. Let's set the lifespan really low. Okay, so I'm going to turn this system off for the moment. But we can see we have particles being generated. Now, right now we have 30 particles being created over 2 frames. I'm going to assign the initial speed, and then I'm going to spawn lots of particles. So let's get the speed to go horizontally, because I actually want these to shoot outward in a bit of a shockwave explosion. So it looks pretty weak right there. Let's make this red so we can see it a bit better. And let's get the speed. We'll crank it up a bit. So it's kind of hard to see, but I have these particles shooting out. It's kind of like a big explosion. Now with the spawn, the reason I'm putting a spawn here is because I actually want to have like each particle then generate lots of other particles around it, like clusters of them. So I'm going to set the spawn to about 28, and there we can see we have these big pockets of particles now being generated. And just as a demonstration, you can play the divergence. You can see they're all coming from those individual points. So I'm going to keep it all the same. Let me just lower the inheritance a little bit and vary it a little bit. And the whole idea is so I just get this explosion of particles shooting out horizontally. And let's just call this shock explosion. Okay. So that's cool. We just have something working there. Now, the reason I didn't include this inside of like doing one big explosion There's a few different reasons. One is that if we have too much stuff kind of feeding in, it's even though we can't see it, there's fuel being leaked out everywhere, and there's temperature as well. So when the next one happens, let me turn that back on now. When the next explosion happens, we would already have a lot of stuff around it, and it would feed off of that, and it just kind of ends up like not being as impulsive and explosive as we want. So I'd rather do this sim, get it really high res, and then do another sim separately that is purely just for the explosion. Now, I might have to look at the timing a little bit just because I know the explosion, the secondary one here, doesn't really happen until, we won't really see it for a good couple of frames. So that's fine, but our initial explosion happens at frame, I guess, technically 8. We don't really see it at frame 7. So I'm just going to be aware of that maybe the timing I'm going to need to play with a little bit, because I think it's really important to get that 1-2, to get 2 hits with the explosion. So everything else, I can pretty much just take my initial explosion grid and duplicate it, because I think, we'll be taking a lot of the similar settings of it. So I'm going to get this grid. I should really name these, but I'm going to get this grid, right click, clone, copy, and let's call this fume effects, and then shock explode. Now, as I've done before, and usually I have buttons for all this stuff rather than doing it in here, but I'm just going to run my repath and move this down a little bit. So this is my new grid. We can see that it's created a directory called shock explode, based on the version and everything, version 2 still. So pretty cool. Definitely saves a lot of time. And initially we can start at a lower resolution, so I'm going to change the spacing. And more importantly, let's go in. I could duplicate this, but I'm just going to remove the emitter and create a new emitter. I'm kind of getting lazy on my, switching this stuff up. So let me just get my grid, make sure, yeah, it is actually in the right place, and that's current. All right, so I'm just going to drop in a particle source. Let's select our particle system, choose shock explosion. And the main thing that I want to do here is change the radius. We'll make it about 8 like it was before. We could actually make it 9 and then have it scale over time. Those are always options as well. So for now, I'm not going to worry about that, but that's sometimes what I'll do is I'll have my emitters scaled down to the point where they stop emitting, and it works really well. Velocity multiplier, I'm going to put at 2 again. All these settings are pretty similar to what I had before. The one thing I might do is just turn smoke off so it doesn't actually create any smoke. However, let's go to the sim tab, and I'm going to scroll down, and we can see that we're generating smoke right here. So that's where I want to kind of put the attention, is just to generate smoke from when the explosion kind of fizzles out. And I'm going to go through this pretty quick. Okay, so we have the shockwave explosion particles. We're animating this over time. So let's get the first key. I'm just going to move it over a little bit and have it settle a little bit quicker as well. So that's the time scale that we had already animated. Now, let's hide the original fume grid so we can just focus on this guy. All right, so the settings I'm going to keep relatively the same. I don't think there's really going to be anything I'm going to change here. Maybe with the fuel, we can come back to this, but that's maybe something I could play with. But for now, let's just focus on getting the dimensions right. So this explosion shoots out fairly far. So I'd be more interested in the width and length than I would be in the height. Oh, that's another thing that I thought about is that with this guy, I might actually make my buoyancy of the temperature a little lower. Okay, so temperature buoyancy, I'm gonna say that's a 0.2, and that means it's not really gonna roll up very high. It's gonna stay relatively the same. So there's gonna be a little bit of raising up, and that's all. So that's the other thing I wanted, is because I can't easily control that. So what I want to be able to do is basically be able to say, as a separate grid, to have this explosion kind of just shoot outwards in the motion that it's doing and not really roll up, whereas the big explosion will. So we have these two beats now. We have 1 and then 2. So I'm going to run a low resolution grid sim, and let's just check it out. Okay, so I just ran a quick sim, and again, low res, but it gives me a pretty good idea of what we're looking at, and I think this looks pretty cool. I definitely would love to see more of these kind of shooting out. And one thing that you might be asking yourself is am I going to simulate this interacting with the geometry here? And I'm probably not going to. Okay, the reason is that this is all made of wood for a start. So typically, I'm going to imagine this explosion is way more forceful than the wood splinters are going to be. So I don't really feel like it's going to interact and wrap around everything as much as it's just going to push everything out of the way. And I also want to use this later on for a few other things. So that's kind of my method behind my madness, I guess. But a couple of things that I do want to do, if we inspect this a bit closer, is it's got a lot of artifacts. So you might see this occasionally where it's like, wow, that looks really kind of ugly, like what's going on? It's because it's simulating, and then the very next frame, there's just too much going on in between each frame, so it doesn't really know how to keep up because it's moving too fast. So we're going to need to at least simulate 2 steps per frame, and I suspected that would need to happen because I want this to be really forceful. So 2 times per frame, or at least capping it out at that, based on our advection stride. This is all stuff that I can get into at another time. There's a lot of fine tuning when it comes to optimizing, but that will definitely kind of get rid of a lot of the steppiness that we're seeing here. And in terms of the shape and everything, again, all that the artifacts will go away, but I like all of this. I just feel like maybe I need to vary this a little bit more. So I might try randomizing the seed and just kind of see what explosion shapes I get, just so I can find one that I feel is really kind of cool. And I'm going to run the sim again. All I've really done is just change the direction a little bit, vary it a little bit, but mainly do sim steps 2. And I just want to demonstrate this so we can see how much that affects things, because I think there's a little bit of a misconception about where and when to apply it. So a lot of people get these artifacts or other weird things, and they just kind of deal with it because it's they're not quite sure what's causing it. So I just want to demonstrate this really quick. And it won't be perfect, but it'll definitely be a lot better. And again, the more we sim stuff, the higher res and everything, the better it's going to be. Okay, so looking at this now, it's definitely looking better. There's still some stuff going on, and I think it's just because it's pretty extreme, the speeds and everything. But I like the shape. I think that's pretty cool. Okay, so before we go any further, one thing I would love to do here is when we look at our explosion, we have this shockwave going outward. We also have stuff going upward. Like I said, I want this to be essentially obliterating everything in its path of destruction, and I want that to also be going down as well. Because I don't want to treat this like it's the floor, I want it to really push down. So because of that, I want there to be a bit of an arc. I want this to actually vertically shoot out some particles. So I'm going to do one more system here. And I'm just going to call this vert explosion. Link that up. And this guy, so let's turn off the other ones for a moment. This one currently is exploding out. I don't really want that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say along the arrow, and if we remember that arrow is default pointing downward, okay? So I'm also going to turn the spawn off just so we can see our initial particles. And I'm just going to lower the speed. This doesn't need to be as intense. But let's set the divergence. And so we just get this kind of simple explosion. I'm going to set the lifespan to be less. But I am... Oops, we already have it. I'm going to turn the spawn back on. And so it's set the divergence here because I want this to kind of be really directional, kind of clusters of stuff. And so it's not going to be too crazy. I'm going to turn the shockwave on as well, but it just means that we have some kind of downward force as well. Now, finally, going to our Scene Explorer, we have our particle source. I should really name this stuff, and I'm not. I apologize for that. I'm going to duplicate this. I'm going to clone it one more time. I'm going to rename this to FFXE for Fume Effects Emitter, and then we'll call this Vert Explosion. I'm going to remove that guy. I'm going to add in the Vert Explosion event. Now the reason I'm doing this is because I wouldn't mind making the radius a little bit smaller. And I'll keep everything else the same. But it just means that with the shock explosion, I'm going to add the new emitter back in. So FFXE Vert Explosion. It just means that this guy might not be as big. I don't know why I keep calling them guys. I've never do that before, but yeah, so these emitters will won't be as big, but I think this should work pretty well. So now we got something pretty crazy. It's got a lot of turbulence. It's got the vorticity, all that good stuff. I'm going to try setting the simulation steps to 3. Now the way the simulation steps works is ever since Fume 2, we've had advection stride, which basically means that you can tell this to sample, sorry, not advection stride, what am I saying? The CFL condition. So the CFL condition basically tells it like how many voxels it needs to travel per frame, and if it gets outside of that realm, then it's going to sample it more. So in other words, if I wanted, I could set this to 10 or something a little bit higher, and it's not going to sim as much, but if it is really drastic, it definitely will. So Fume 1, it would force it to sim every single frame, which was kind of ridiculous, but here it's kind of like if it needs to, it'll go up as many steps as you allow it. So you can set the CFL condition for that. Advection stride, again, I'll get into another time, but it's basically going to be the sensitivity of when it'll stop kind of subsampling the iterations. So in other words, if you want to get like really nice curls and a lot of subtle detail, you'll need to bring this down. But for what we're doing, it's not really necessary. It's more for low density things. So this is our explosion, and I'm going to run the sim, and we can check this out. If we want this to be a bit more explosive, and I wouldn't mind it, we can try adding more particles. So right now, the explosion looks like that. We can try adding more. Let's just try 35. And we'll get the variation and tone that back a bit so they're all kind of clustered on each other. Let's just try that and let's see how this looks. I'm going to give this a little bit more resolution. Actually, two things I'm going to mention really quick. One thing we can do in here, if we go back to our explosion, is I can, to the particle system, sorry, is I can change this to sample more times per frame. And because these are happening so quick, I think that's probably better, just so that way it's sampling 4 times per frame. For something like this, it's not really going to, we're not doing anything too complex, but it will just definitely allow us to have a smoother motion, because our fume sim is sampling, potentially 3 times per frame. So it's good to at least get that to do it 3 times rather than half. The other thing, just having a quick look at the sim, I wouldn't mind varying this more, because I think originally I was going to make it cluster in, like, where is it? Cluster in quite a lot. I'm going to keep this one pretty low, but this one here, I wouldn't mind just adjusting the variation a little bit. Sorry, on this one, the shock explosion, just so there's a lot more to fill out everything. All right, cool. Okay, so this is the sim, just what we've got here. Now, keep in mind a couple of things, because I think this works pretty well. Most of it's going to be initially occluded, because it'll be inside of the structure as it all blows out. And there's also going to be a lot of secondary effects, and we're not going to do those yet. We're doing the primary explosions, and then we're doing the dynamics, and then we're doing the secondary effects. So at this point, this is working out pretty well in terms of the look and everything. We probably don't need to go as far as 3. I'm just going to cap it at 2 for now. I think ideally 3 is better in this situation, but I'm just going to keep it at 2 just because I want to kind of keep this moving pretty quickly. And everything's looking pretty cool. I like how this looks. It's a weird angle, but the explosion itself, I think it works pretty well. I can picture it with everything else in context. So right now it feels a little bit too perfect and round, but I imagine when I'm having little bits of trails of fire, debris, everything else, it's going to work out pretty well. All right. So at this point, I'm going to run sims on both of these, and I'm going to keep them fairly high res because I like how this is looking. I might render out a frame just to kind of see it again in context, but I like how it's all looking. What I'd like to do ultimately is run a wavelet turbulence on all of these, so that way we get a lot of additional kind of secondary detail. So I'm just going to quickly render this out just so we can see it in context. And that's actually one thing, because I have been going through this really quickly, I didn't really do was look at it in context. And what I mean by that is look at it in the viewport, get an idea of how big this is. And that's precisely why we're doing the fume first, so we can get an idea of how big it's going to look. Because now I'm looking at it, it is actually pretty damn big. But I think this will work. I think this is fine. I do feel like the fire is a little too extreme, things like that. So we can definitely balance those out. So just looking at this again, just make sure this should actually be 2.5. For some reason, it was at 0.5. So just make sure the smoke is at 2.5, because that's what I intended for it to be. And I think that will drastically help this. Now, if we look at this from the GPU at least, when we start playing with the blend, this will taper the fire back inside of it a little bit. And I think for this, it's probably going to work better. Okay, that's why, sorry, I'm going crazy here. 2.5 is on the smoke. I thought for some reason we were in the smoke. Yeah, so, putting this to like 500 will blend it in a little bit. But, 2.5 for the smoke, that's good. We can tone this back if we feel it's too strong. I'm actually bringing my opacity down just a little bit, because I don't want this to be as intense as our big explosion. So all I've changed here is I put my blend up to 500 and I drop my opacity from 0.5 to 0.2. I'll try rendering another frame. And I'm not going to play too much beyond that. I just want to kind of get the basics in, just because obviously right now it's pretty harsh and that just looks out of place. Whereas with the big explosion, you know, most of it's buried inside of it, so that's fine, but I just don't want this stuff to be too much of a contrast between the fire and the smoke. Okay, so this definitely looks better. I still feel it's a little extreme in terms of the contrast and everything. So we can tone that back a little bit. I'm kind of tempted to do it inside of the temp scale here. So it's pretty sensitive, but let's just try and bring it from 4 to 3.7. And I think this is a good example of where we can kind of balance things a little bit. Like I said, the black body shader, I'm not 100% sold on. I do like it, but you know, it definitely has its own kind of stylized look, and you don't really have a lot of controls over color and everything else. But it just depends on what we're going for. Okay, so it's definitely toned back. All right, so my final thing, I'm just going to keep that at 4. And I'm just going to put this down at 0.15, so it's, or 0.1. Very subtle, but I think that will help. You know, and again, we still want it to be intense. It's just as it begins to die out. Okay, finally, I'm gonna run a wavelet on this, and I'll save that for like another time in terms of like, I've got my own kind of love-hate relationship with wavelet as well. I kind of pick my battles with it because it's a lot more work to get things simmed, but it can be pretty cool. A couple things I'm going to do. I'm going to put sharpen on the fire and smoke, which I think will help a lot. Sorry, on the temperature and smoke. And I'm going to enable wavelet, and all these channels are now being exported, so my caches are going to get pretty damn big pretty fast. So like these are 11 meg per frame. I can imagine they're going to get bigger. These are looking at 500, so when we go to wavelet, for instance, it's probably going to go up to a gig per frame or more. But I'm going to run a simulation of this, and from there, we'll take a look, and I'll take it from there. I'm going to turn off the boundless here. I don't think we really are going to need it, but let me just take a look at this. Okay, so I think that's going to be fine. I'm going to run a simulation of this. I'm going to make the resolution. I don't need this one to be as high res as the main explosion, because I want a lot of the detail that really makes the scale of the shot come from that, whereas I want the impact and a lot of the initial cause of the destruction to come from this sim. Okay, so I'm going to run this sim at around 400 by 400 by 160. It's pretty low res. When I run the wavelet, obviously it'll double, but that to me is fine. I think that's okay. But I'm also going to run a wavelet on my high-res grid. So wavelet turbulence. So outputting all of these. The resolution, I'm going to keep the same. So in other words, when we do the wavelet, it's going to double because I'm going to go for 2. So in other words, it'll be 1000, 1000, then 866. So it's going to be really high res. Okay, so I'm going to run these sims now, and then we can take a look. Okay, and so here we can see the final result. And so obviously we've still got a long way to go. There's definitely more we want to do, but as for the actual explosion, I'm liking what we have. I think this is looking really cool. Here's another take of it as well. So we've got a few different, I'll get 2 renders here we can take a look at. One thing I really like is just, you know, we got that lingering fire. It kind of like softly illuminates all the way until death. So that's one thing I really like about the black body shader, is just the way it's able to maintain a lot of the internal illumination, because it's based on temperature rather than necessarily just using the fire channel. Okay, so all in all, I like this. I think this is a great start. I definitely want it to have more kick. We're gonna have like a really big punchy explosion and add more to this, and obviously all the fragmenting and everything else. but as the explosion itself, I think this is working out really great so far.